Okay, so I would like to welcome you once again to the lecture series, The Critical Gaze, Reflections on Global Crises in Portuguese Language Comics at the University of Cologne. My name is Yannick Scholz. I'm a research assistant at the Portuguese Brazilian Institute here at the University of Cologne. And it's my great pleasure to introduce today's guest, Ivan Lima Gomes. Ivan Lima Gomes is a professor for the theory and methodology of history at the State University of Goiás in Brazil. He holds a degree in history from the Universidade Federal Fluminense in 2007 and a master's degree in social history from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in 2010. He studied political and cultural issues related to the history of Brazilian comics, and he holds a PhD in social history from the Universidade Federal Fluminense, again, obtained in 2015. Sorry for that, I just have to check for the participants which are still coming. In his study, he researched the meanings of comics in Brazil and Chile from two publishers and the tensions between art, market, and politics present in their comics. Since 2010, he has been professor of theory and methodology at the State University of Goiás, and his research interests include contemporary history, history of Brazil and America, social history of culture, visual culture, history and communication and theory, and also methods of history teaching. He published several academic papers on different topics, many of them on Brazilian comics, and he also conducted an interview with Marcelo de Salete, which is a famous Brazilian comic artist. And still, for those of you who do not read Portuguese, let me just recommend two recent English titles. One is from 2016 and was published in the book Cultures of Comic Works. And the title of his article is Recognizing Comics as Brazilian National Popular Culture. And the other one was published last year in James Schroer's book, Comics Beyond the Page in Latin America, and is entitled Comics on the Walls, the Ninguém Street Comics, and the Experience of the Outsider View of Rio de Janeiro. You can find both texts on academia.edu. And today, Ivan Lima Gomes will provide us with an historical overview on Black visualities in Brazilian comics, which is a great opening, I guess, for the Brazilian section of this lecture series. And Ivan, we are very pleased to have you here today, and you may start with your presentation.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, thank you. Well, let me project my presentation here. Share. Okay, can you see it? Yeah, let me from the beginning. Well, I'm gonna, first of all, thank you, Yannick, for the presentation, and thanks everyone for being here with me today. And I'm gonna read a presentation since English is not my, I'm not a native speaker, so I may get a little bit lost. So I guess reading can help me a little bit. And if I'm reading it too fast or if it's too confusing, please tell me to get slower and stop it, okay? You can interrupt me. Good morning, afternoon, everyone. First, I would like to salute everyone here. The COVID-19 pandemic demanded that we rearrange our plans and look for ways to keep and strengthen our scientific research and support network. In spite of such a difficult situation, it is quite joyful to be able to share some remarks to so qualified audience. Professor Yannick already introduced me, but I just would like to should say that nowadays I am adjunct professor of Latin American history at the Federal University of Goiás. It's like a cousin of a state university of Goiás. So it changes a little bit, but not so much. And today I will be presenting a few preliminary notes around racial visualities in Brazilian comics from a historical perspective. To do that, I will use two case studies in rather distinctive historical contexts as a starting point, so that the rupture and the continuity on operations concerning the Black race visibility or invisibility, if we can put it that way, in the prediction of comics in Brazil can be highlighted. It is important to remind you that this is just the first draft as for the study of this topic. So these are really preliminary notes. I'm going to share with you a couple of ideas and questions so that you can help me discuss an approach on Black visualities in Brazilian comics. First topic, being a Black kid in Brazilian comics. Created by Ailton Tomás during the 60s, the comic strip Bingo, o Pequeno Jornaleiro, it's something like Bingo, the Little Paper Boy, or Newspaper Boy, substituted another comic strip called Piazito, a kid comic strip as defined by Ian Gordon, whose main character was a white boy from the Brazilian southern region. This Piazito comic strip about Bingo. Bingo was published in the last month of the main action in defense of the local production of comics against the American, as they said, cultural imperialism in the early 60s, known as SETPA, originally based in the capital city of the Brazilian southern state of Rio Grande do Sul, Porto Alegre. With names like Flávio Colim, Renato Canini, and Júlio Shimamoto, among others, directly or indirectly involved, and the support of politicians like Leonel Brizola and Jânio Quadros. And the main aim of SETPA was to establish public policies to foster the local production by reinforcing the harmful influence of comics published in the US. With strong caricatural appeal, Bingo was a Black child who sold newspapers and solved crimes. Actually, he's one of the very few Black protagonists in Brazilian comics. Before that, there had been Black characters in Brazilian comics since the first decades of the 21st century. Names like, for example, Gibi, in this comic called O Talento do Juquinha, Juquinha's Talent, published by O Tico Tico, directly inspired by Richard Outcault's Buster Brown. Gibi was a servant at Juquinha's house. So names like Gibi and Benjamin is part of this whole history of depictions of Buster Brown, of Outcault's Buster Brown, and Benjamin is like a sidekick for the Brazilian Buster Brown, Chiquinho, and or for example, Azeitona here, of these comics called Reco Reco, Bolão e Azeitona. So there were a few Black characters in Brazilian comics during the first decades of the 20th century. All of those are very well recognized among the scholars and comic memorialists. Another example is the comic book called Gibi, named after the mascot boy in Roberto Marinho's publishing, who would be better known than the one previously published by J. Carlos. Sooner, Marinho's creation would aggregate a new meaning to this kind of format of publication. What used to be a synonym for mischievous boy, GB, is like a mischievous boy, became the name of the format of publication in Brazil. In other words, in Brazil, we call comic books GB, still today. The visual construction of the character GB, and also a character like Ebony White, Eisner's sidekick created for the hero spirit, must have been the source of inspiration used by Ailton Tomás to conceive Bingo. However, Bingo is still very little recognized by admirers and scholars of this topic, even being published in big newspapers like A Última Hora and A Noite in the first half of the 60s. In fact, Bingo has a very peculiar history. Differently from other Setpa comics, Tomás' strip was not straight produced by Setpa, but to be part of the comic strip of the newspaper A Noite. It was part of the attractions to relaunch the newspaper, which had been facing financial issues since mid-50s. Therefore, it's not a genuine creation of the Setpa Studios, which reinforces the fact that none of its group members can remember Tomás or his work related to the publishing company. I interviewed several Setpa's artists, and none of them remember who was Ailton Tomás. In fact, Ailton Tomás has already died, and he died, nobody remembered him. He died completely ignored by the press and by comics memories and comics scholars. Well, it's more likely that Tomás' strip was distributed by Setpa because it was in agreement somehow with its proposal for nationalizing comics. Based on Bingo's release, the newspaper seemed to take a stand in the debates about the nationalization of comics, given to Bingo a larger space if compared to other comics published by A Noite, like The Lone Ranger, Rick Bradford, Beetle Bailey, and other Disney comics. Bingo topped almost half of the comic section of the newspaper, celebrated as a special national creation for it. After the initial excitement in regards to the comic strip, it started losing ground gradually in the newspaper, until its publishing was interrupted slightly over 9 months later, which indicates the public resisted, did not like maybe this comic strip. It's possible to point out that Bingo had its relevance in the center of Setpa's editorial project, taking into account two characters. First, Bingo represented the childlike universe, mainly constituted of Black characters. Actually, Bingo was probably the first Brazilian comic strip with the broad prominence of Black characters depicting their everyday life in a popular vein. Even though the Black image adopted by the strip for the Black characters has allowed association with those representations adopted since the mid-19th century has a firm reduction of the social definition of the Black race, it is necessary to be cautious with the establishment of unmediated analogies. Bingo pointed towards a different understanding of what had been practiced up to that moment when we thought about a representation of Black people in comics. Bingo is the leading character, and he was not the support or sidekick for white characters bigger than he was. His partner in the adventures was his cousin from the countryside, who would get involved in Bingo's daily life without becoming a sidekick like Robin, Bucky, or Ebony White. Besides, the characters' lines were written in speech bubbles without language misuses or cacophonies that focused on showing grammar mistakes, which was really common among Black characters until that moment. Finally, Bingo and his peers' social reality was represented in a way to highlight the sociabilities and the cultural traditions typical of Rio de Janeiro's lower classes. The second most remarkable peculiarity of Bingo is the urban ambience in the city of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Bingo reinforced Setpa's speech with another regional reality, Rio de Janeiro was one, which contradicts historiographical attempts to explain the failure of Setpa due to its regional reach. In this way, Bingo's Rio de Janeiro inserted Setpa, a group from the south of Brazil, into a dialogue with another reality. About the comic strip plot, the story continues with the news that Bingo's aunt and youngest cousin were moving to his house, which was a reason for his and his mother's joy. All of them were clearly profiled as poor people, as we can assume from the strip projected here. In the first picture, Bingo would not stop carrying newspapers, which represented the source for his family's income, and the newspapers here. Beside him, his cousin Pedrinho would carry a bundle of clothes on his head. And following that, the frame shows a poor community in an idyllic way, with grass and bird in the foreground. After a typical family breakfast, Bingo leaves for work and takes his cousin Pedrinho to follow him throughout the city, when the action actually begins in the comic strip. At this point, we can see an explicit reference to the city of Rio de Janeiro. Both of them go towards Barreira do Vasco, one of the many slums in the city, aboard a full crowded camel car called Alegria, which means happiness in Portuguese. Full crowded bus or trains are still really common in Brazil, and really dangerous in pandemic times. Following the whole hilarious experience regarding the public cable car, the two of them arrive at Barreira do Vasco to meet the community's gang. With wide knowledge of the art of serenade, they aimed at finding an acoustic guitarist called Tutti, which for me is a clear reference to Tutti, who is a guitarist dead in 1957, responsible for introducing the 7-string acoustic guitar in the choro, a very well-known Brazilian popular music genre. And suddenly Bingo starts to sing. In the following verses, the character exalts his origins and the slum where he was born in. There is this lyric in the middle of the comic strip. A free translation of it would be, I want to leave the favela of my illusion. All I have belongs to her, and she's in my heart. I want to let my love crying with compassion. If I leave the favela, I will also leave my guitar. Bingo's celebration of the sociabilities practiced in the slums dialogues is part of the set of massive productions that showed images and representations of the lower classes in newspapers and photos, and also in films and movies. And briefly, from my perspective, Bingo interacts with a movie like Nelson Pereira dos Santos, Rio 40 Graus, a movie, 55 movie. It is illustrative, for example, that the first strip projected here, published in the newspaper A Noite, has been an aerial view of a sightseeing like the Sugar Loaf here, followed by a description of the Copacabana neighborhood, where you can find nice people and also smart people like pickpockets. Here, you can see pickpockets here. The similarity between this comic strip and Santos' film is quite clear, has a very similar situation happen in the letter from very specific perspectives of moving language, of course. In the movie, there are a series of aerial takes with typical tourist attractions assembled through an instrumentation version of the catchy song A Voz do Morro, together with scenes from shanty towns, favelas, and focusing in the actions of a group of boys. In this way, if Santos' movie is usually analyzed in Brazil from a perspective of a Brazilian aesthetics ownership of the Italian neorealistic cinema, Bingo can be understood in a similar way. By applying aspects of this cinematographic aesthetics to the language of comics, it can be seen as the cornerstone of what I call national popular childish culture, and according to the considered case, incorporated to an editorial initiative of nationalizing comics. Other scenarios beyond the Rio de Janeiro's postcards images composed Bingo's urban geography, like the Maracanã Stadium, where they went to watch a football game between Flamengo and Vasco da Gama, probably the two most important football teams in the city. Tomás' strips focused in the supporters' reactions, humorously dealing with the diversified universe of absurd situations that might happen in a football match, such as the crowd, the joy, and the rivalry among those. Praising Bingo and Pedrinho, black characters living in slums and sympathetic to the ways of life of the lower classes of the region, as supporters for Flamengo, in contrast with those from Vasco da Gama, mainly represented by Portuguese-originated ones, European ones, was not a naive choice of Ailton Tomás. The artist dialogued with an imaginary that related Flamengo with popular causes, Black identity, and national identity that was in place between 1945 and 1964. Having already used such strategy before, for example, when he worked for a publishing house called EBAL, in Portuguese would be Editora Brasil América Limitada, Brazil America Publishing House, freely translated. When he adapted, he drawn a cover for the magazine, the comic book Superman. This is a Brazilian cover of Superman, where we can see a kid, black kid, using a kind of a Flamengo uniform. And this was drawn by Ailton Tomás, the same author of Bingo. Back to Bingo, the game was left aside after an unscored penalty of Bellini, Vasco's back over a Flamengo striker. The focus turned to the supporters who went wild after that and started fighting among each other, which turned out to be a great opportunity for BIPoC to act. Bingo and Pedrinho intervened and managed, after some struggle, to hold him with the police support. As a reward, the victim gave them 2,000 cruzeiros, the adopted currency in the country at that time, and they could happily leave to buy some bread for the mothers. End of the story. If Bingo can help us to suggest a historical overview on Brazilian comics of more than half of the 20th century. Now let's move a few decades later and discuss one major 21st century Brazilian graphic novel, which is my second topic here. Graphic novels in Brazil, Angola and the graphic resistance to slavery. The first decade of the 21st century established graphic novels as the dynamic contemporary narrative to discuss Brazilian history and society. Countless authors, publishers, comic shops, and readers and roles eager for issues that are more relevant about topics related to politics, sexual choices, and identities. Graphic novels have inspired films, and books as well have some relevance in literary conferences. New authors have worked with such narratives to approach topics such as racism and feminism in a sense of actively intervening in Brazilian society. These are, for example, a series of graphic interventions produced during the 2018 presidential campaign, where several comics artists drawn comics against Jair Bolsonaro's and produced and they supported the hashtag "Ele não, not him," due to the fact that he is clearly a misogynist, a misogynic person. Most of these are aligned with the fight for historically excluded minorities, which have become the main target of more conservative groups, and that have lately used the political instability of the country to carry out policies of extermination against Black people and the poor. An indicative of this is the brutal murder of the councillor Marielle Franco from the left-wing party PSOL, and her driver Anderson Gomes in March 2018, which after almost 3 years continues without answers regarding those ordering the crime. Rapidly, her face became a clear synonym of the absolute authoritarianism of the Brazilian politics and its plan to suppress minorities. Franco became an icon of this fight, symbolizing the historical and continuous silencing of some identities as women, Black, and homosexuals. The comics promptly responded to that and contributed to give Franco a voice and a face and an expression, which made her a worldwide reference to defend a fairer society. Such works play a sensitive role and allow people to build up from a historical perspective, I quote here, an image of others by giving them a social identity, as defended by Alain Corbin, end of quotation. These others of the comics breaks up, these others of the comics break up with some paradigms found in this kind of language, which stands as a formal expression produced by men, about men, and for men, and has superheroes as a narrative genre for excellence. Together with this debate about gender and sexuality in Brazilian comics, topics related to the place of Black people and the structural development of racism in the country have been source of interpretation for many Brazilian artists. Works like Morro da Favela by André Diniz, about the reporter and photographer Maurício Horta, dweller in a famous Rio, Morro da Providência, which was originally called Morro da Favela. In addition, Carolina, a graphic biography by Selene Barbosa and João Pinheiro about the Black writer Carolina de Jesus, author of Quarto de Despejo. Finally, the series Conto dos Orixás by Hugo Canuto, which uses the same perspective of superhero comic books to somehow deconstruct them, directly inspired by Jack Kirby's work on Marvel Comics during the 60s. It is not a surprise that the Black resistance to slavery during the colonial period, from the establishment of the Quilombo dos Palmares, has been turned into comics. After all, it is very likely that it represents a longer and multifaceted project of an alternative way of life to that colonial standardized one, from the disobedience of the enslaved Black people. In his recent research about Black representations of race and Black characters in Brazilian comics, Nobuyoshi Shinen records comics produced since the since 1950s about Zumbi and about the Quilombo dos Palmares, with a considerable raise in the first years of the 21st century. This one here actually is a pretty interesting one because it's a contribution of two important names for Brazilian culture. Columbus Moura, which is who is a well-known Black sociologist and a pioneer in Black studies in Brazil, and Alfred de Moya, who is a relevant name in history of journalism and history of comics in Brazil. Actually, he's one of the first comics scholars here in Brazil. Well, among those who erupt in the actual scene, aligned with the criticism against the madness of racist structures in the Brazilian society, one of the most internationally celebrated by the public and the specialized critics is certainly Marcelo Salete. Artist and graphic illustrator, he is the author of Angola Janga, a monumental work that graphically elaborates on a history of Palmares, as defended in the subheading of the Brazilian edition, a history of Palmares, uma história de Palmares. It combines bibliographic, documentary, iconographic research on topics like the African diaspora and the slavery in the Portuguese America, with a dynamic narrative full of symbolisms linked to the African Brazilian culture. So it's full of paratests like chronology and maps and so on. The impact of the Salete's work can be felt in academic studies and comic studies, which contrasts a lot with the lack of scholarship about a comic strip like Bingo or even the comic book GB, for example, mentioned before. Taking into account the fact that Angola Janga was published about 2 years ago, it is remarkable that it already presents considerable academic critical baggage around itself. In general, works reinforce the relevance of de Salete's work. The relevance of de Salete's work to the visibility of the Black slavery in Brazil, comparing it to present days. Excerpts of works like Angola Janga and Cumbe, which is a work prior to Angola Janga in approaching topics linked to the colonial slavery, are available in academic journals like Carialu. Interviews with de Salete conducted by researchers are also available in Portuguese and in English. I interviewed by Marcelo de Salete for an academic journal, and there is also an interview at this academic journal called Carialu. For example, another example, recent research in history teaching focusing on creating a comic book to represent the feminine resistance during the 19th century slavery, inspired by primary sources, find in de Salete's work a major inspiration, which clearly signposts the richness of the exchange of history written in and outside academia. This is a work of research developed by Roberta Marcelino Veloso, titled Imagens de uma Escrava Rebelde, images of enslaved rebel woman, comics and genre and the teaching of history. Here, I would like to highlight 3 studies. First, the investigations, the studies developed by Jasmine Robel, which is our colleague here. I guess I always pronounce it as a Portuguese Jasmine or Yasmin or Hasmin. She is so international that we can choose these 3 ways to pronounce her name, but she emphasized the homologies in 17th century's Palmares and present-day São Paulo in topics like violence, racism, death, and the main role of Black men and women in rewriting their own stories of life. Robel is able to notice what she calls an inverted timeline between Dissaletti's first works, acquainted in the urban outskirts of big cities, and more recent ones like Cumbi and Angola, which try to show the slavery during Brazil's colonial era. Dissaletti seems to confirm the author's comprehension by clearly recognizing the social place of his work in a context with aggravated social conflicts and the growth of a conservatory agenda that intends to silence the Black voices that try to address the racial exclusion problem in Brazil. Here is a quotation of Dissaletti. Let me put it this way. The size, the dimension of such endeavor was gradually formed throughout the time. Little by little, I noticed that there was something to explore through comics when it comes to the fight against the violence during the colonial time. A counter-narrative opposing the concept of racial and social harmony in our background, which remains until the present day. Now that we have first presidential election, this interview was made during 2018 presidential campaign. And now that we have a fierce presidential election, important. Such discourse tries to nullify intense conflicts against a colonial and centralized project. Resistance ruled by marginalized Black and Indigenous populations. I was slowly realizing the dimension of the book in this environment. Many times while talking to other people, new ideas and possibilities of understanding these pictures and stories arise. Therefore, the idea of the book is to present these characters in a more human and fully complex way. A second study focused on the critical views of second studies focuses on the critical views of Flávio Gomes, a Brazilian historian specialized in slavery and Black resistance in the Portuguese America. He discusses Dissaletti's comics as, he says, original experience, which updated the debate about the Quilombo's experience to the 21st century reader by prioritizing the Africanisms in them. Since these refugees communities also worked as a recreation of Africa, they were represented with, also quoting Gomes, a perspective of a cosmos that linked spirits, forests, memories, and ancestors. While talking specifically about Angola, Gomes points out that this is a history of Palmares, instead of defining it as the definitive history of Palmares. This and the use of the expression Angola Janga, which means little Angola, to represent the Quilombo dos Palmares, has some of its inhabitants did. In fact, it contrasts to the fact that the word Palmares is almost never used by Dissaletti. Flávio Gomes suggests that the work Angola Janga implies in the possibilities of several Palmares. In other words, it's a history to be told, several histories to be told. And I would add in the past and in the present. Here, Flávio Gomes also reinforces that there is a choice here for a non-linear historical approach, in contrast to a narrative focusing in the origin, the rise, and the downfall of the Black resistance, which is still pretty common when it comes to narratives about the Palmares experience. It always finishes with the violent suppression of it. And he emphasized that Angola Janga does not work that way, which is very powerful in terms of the Black identity. And despite, the third work, and despite not directly discussing Angola Janga, the interpretation of the researcher Nohora Fernandes regarding Cumbe suggests interesting reflections about Dissavetti's works. Fernandes bases on concepts like opaqueness, detour, and marronnage, elaborated by the Martinican philosopher Edouard Glissant. From these, she understands that the stories presented in Cumbe operate on a narrative logic which is ambiguous and escaping, trying to compose, as she says, a new file, a counter-argument which faces founding narratives about the Black subjectivity established in Brazil with works like Casagrande and Senzala, written by the sociologist Gilberto Freire. So she opposes Marcelo de Salet's work and Casagrande and Senzala's, Gilberto Freire's Casagrande and Senzala, Gilberto Freire's work. Hence, her attention to focusing on the Black visibility while drawing also present in Angola Janga. The drawings would operate as an ambiguous and dark struggle with the traumatic experience of colonization. And I do believe these pages are really impressive and confirms her interpretation. It has an ambiguous and dark struggle with the traumatic experience of colonization, contrasting so with a whole series of representations of silence slavery, which Fernandes associates with Freire. Well, as a conclusion, best to follow. The 13th of May is an important and historical date associated with the fight of Black movements, as it represents the abolition of slavery happened in Brazil in 1888. Considering the federal government, an institution like the Palmares Foundation, we have here in Brazil an institution called Palmares Foundation, Fundação Palmares, is officially committed with the, and I quote the text presented in the website of Palmares Foundation, preservation of cultural, social, and economic values derived from Black influence in constituting the Brazilian society. This Palmares Foundation published the last year, 2019, the following quotes on its site. Zumbi, hero of the Black consciousness, enslaved by the left wing. So, for a long time, there are contrasting narratives about Zumbi, which and these narratives try to deconstruct Zumbi as a relevant character for the progressive movements. So here is an institution effort to deconstruct Zumbi, seen as enslaved by the left wing. So he's an instrumental figure to promote the left wing agenda and the communist agenda and so on. Typical of the Bolsonaro's era. It intends to deconstruct the image of Zumbi, one of the main leaders of the Quilombo dos Palmares, and a symbol of Black resistance claiming until nowadays in the fight against racism and prejudice. The messages posted on the site of Fundação Palmares Foundation add up to countless other sad expressions of prejudice and disrespect to African Brazilian populations uttered by the current government. It is possible to surmise that updating it in a critical way, to surmise that updating in a critical way the narrative of the Quilombo dos Palmares, also known as Angola Janga, is to take part in the safeguard of tolerance and racial equality. It means, above all, opposing to authoritarianism. It therefore reinforces the political relevance of Disseret's work. Part of the relevance of Disseret's work is his efforts to suggest a deep review of Brazilian historiography, not only in terms of themes and issues at first neglected in the big amount of slavery studies and slavery scholarship, but in a way next to what the French historian Yvan Jablonka suggested as the third continent, where the narrative potentialities of history and fiction join forces to develop an effective way of narrating the past. An emotional and affectionate understanding of the past is necessary to develop a recorder of history, which notes the past has a sphere of possibilities that suggest challenges to present times. As a result of the Portuguese process of colonization and its domination project upon African bodies, Palmares is a place, continent, full of histories to be told. That also leads to another combination from the perspective of the history, as a discipline and its public relevance to discuss the experience of colonialism embodied in the trajectories of Black men and women, which goes along with the public extent of historical knowledge and the importance of Angola agenda in mediating these discussions. To think in terms of other histories must also apply to Brazilian comics history as a whole. In other terms, it means that it's important to move beyond linear narratives that reinforce entrepreneurial and successful trajectories mostly developed by white men, white artists, white comics artists. Hence, Disseret teaches us it is important to visit the archives, to develop focused researchers on comics histories, and to let it introduces new doubts to our current researchers. That's what happened to me when I first met Bingo. That's basically how I met Bingo. I visited several archives and read several newspapers, and suddenly I found this comic book, which was totally neglected by the current Brazilian comics scholarship. Even Noguchinian's book, which is pretty amazing and intends to produce an entire inventory of Black representations in Brazilian comic books, did not mention Bingo. So it's the relevance of archives to produce a counter-narrative of comics history. For one side, it maintains several of the, about Bingo, sorry. For one side, Bingo maintains several of the stereotypical representations of Black people presented in comics history. However, its plot doesn't support discrimination or other controversial topics historically related to Black characters in comics during the first decades of the 20th century. In fact, Bingo invites the reader to meet an everyday life of a poor Brazilian kid, and invite comics scholars to engage on a deeper level to research further Brazilian comics in order to forge a Black tradition of comics in Brazil. By the way, we must remember that in Brazil, it is still common to call comic books as GBs. So to talk about comic books is to talk about GBs, is to talk about Black kids, Black representations. It's time to assume it in all of its consequences. To finish my presentation, I guess I took a lot of time here. To finish my presentation, I would like to bring here a quote from Achille Mbembe's amazing work, Critique of the Black Reason, as it is a suggestive interpretation of the crisis we live in the present time. I quote Mbembe's now. But who among us can doubt that the moment has finally arrived for us to begin from ourselves? While Europe goes astray, overtaken by the mistake of, overtaken by the malaise of not knowing where it is within and with the world, is it not time to lay the foundation for something absolutely new? To do so, will we have to forget blackness? Or perhaps, on the contrary, must we hold on its false power, its luminous, fluid, and crystalline character? That strange subject is slippery, serial, and plastic, always masked, firmly camped on both sides of the mirror, constantly skirting the edge of the frame. And if by chance, in the midst of this torment, blackness survives those who invented it, and if all of subaltern humanity becomes black in a reversal to which only history knows the secret, what risks would becoming black of the world pose to the promise of liberty and universal equality for which the term black has stood throughout the modern period? End of quotation. I'm very aware that vein does not refer exactly to comics will suggest the relevance of blackness in contrast to the false power of that strange subject is livery, serial, and plastic, always masked. But when mentioning serial, plastic, and masked, really brings something to us comics scholars. But this sounds so suggestive to me to think of blackness in Brazilian comics as a critic of several operations of invisibility that still work today, that delegates the potency of black visual culture in comics, in these terms, to the edge of the frame. Now maybe it's time to move beyond this frame. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivan. If you stop the screen sharing, then we can see you. That's great. Okay. Thank you so much for that talk and for that arc you opened up from the 60s to today's comics and then back to Palmares. So we had a great overview, I guess, on the Black visualities. And I would like to open the discussion. As I already said, if you have a question, please let us know in the chat so that there is a list. And then to ask your question, please activate your camera and your microphone. And I'm waiting for the first question, which came right now from Yasmin.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much, Ivan, for this brilliant talk and this very insightful material you brought, this very broad panorama that you brought to the table. I really appreciate getting to know this rich material I didn't know in part, and I just want to take up a point that you mentioned at the final of your presentation, at the end of your presentation, related to the archival function that comics can have and that comics indeed have. I was thinking that, of course, you showed those examples, the comic strips from the 60s and so on, when we see that these depictions unfold against a visual racist archive in relation to the depiction of the facial features, this black-facing type of depiction. And then you went on to Marcelo Gisalete, who has, I think, or gives the comic a type of self-archiving function. You already said that he fills a type of void, vazio of voices that hadn't had the chance to express their experiences in that way. And I think he does that within a very different aesthetic also, and in dialogue with different epistemologies. Sometimes when critics talk about Marcelo Gisalete's work as magical realism or something, I find that really problematic, because it's something different. I think it's a whole other epistemology, even if he uses the book as the object or platform for his graphic epos, if you want to use that word, which would again be a European tradition and wouldn't be the right thing probably. Maybe you could comment a bit on this function of the counter archive in the comic as counter archive and its role and importance, maybe especially in the Afro-Brazilian context.
Sure, thank you, Jasmine. And I totally agree with you. I mean, to say that de Salet's work is a kind of magical realism seems really strange to me as well. I do think that, as you said, he develops in his work a kind of black visuality, which is rather distinct than European or well-established visual ways of seeing. These three excerpts of Salet's work that I showed, that I projected here, you can see. I can project them again. I guess they can help us think. I guess you see, yeah, everyone is seeing, okay? You can clearly see that, you see, for example, here, he has this architecture, this frame architecture that's really clear, and the use of abstraction. There is this point, I guess, many scholars did not attempt yet, as you mentioned, this magical dimension, this symbolic dimension. But I do believe that even if de Salet is well grounded in history, he uses a lot of abstraction. There is a visual abstraction that dialogues, of course, has, the scholars mentioned here, said about the opaqueness, the silence, and the trauma, and the things that you cannot say, and that you bring it into your body. But there is this abstract dimension that helps to forge a counter narrative. And in that sense, how an artist like de Salet develops the process of forging an archive through his work is really interesting. He has a clear problem to solve about the place of Black people and the traumatic experience of Black enslavement in Brazil. And then he forges an archive through his work with coherent bibliographic research and material and visual cultural research. And this is why he sounds so fascinating for readers and for scholars, because he integrates both aspects. And for me, it's also really interesting because if for one side it brings how can I say? It's really clear that he develops a Black visuality. He promotes a new way of seeing the limit, and it's really interesting. And at first we considered it's it's a history of Palmares, so he's gonna tell us how the Quilombo developed and how it was suppressed and so on. But several readers in Brazil found Angola Janga a really challenging reading. It's not. Several people complain that it's not an easy book. I guess some people consider as it is a comic book or a graphic novel, it should be easy. I guess there is this thing going on. But several people say, for example, that it was very difficult to read Angola Janga because the characters all seem the same. and people talk this kind of thing and do not think what they are saying, because for me, to say that the characters are the same is part of our colonized gaze. I mean, we are supposed to consider that Black characters have a well-defined characteristics, like those. Like he must be stereotypical and really distinctive and so on. And when an artist like Marcelo de Salete forges a more complex, nuanced, and sensitive way of representing Black people, people consider this really strange and start to complain that the characters are all the same. And this is also a way to question our epistemological gaze, the way we see, and that it's part of our formation, of our tradition. So all of this is to say that I consider Angola Janga, through its archival procedures and its aesthetics and so on, a book that challenges even the archive itself. I mean, where would you insert, how would you define a book like De Salete? Is this historiography? Is this literature? I don't know exactly. A similar challenge was introduced, for example, by Art Spiegelman's mouse. Art Spiegelman's, in Art Spiegelman's interviews, he always he's always very reluctant to say that Mouse is a fiction book. But on the other side, it's not a historiographical, an academic book. So these books, they are at the boundary of such catalogations. It's fiction. How can you say that a history of Palmares or a history of the racial discrimination is a fiction? I don't know. But is this an academic work? I don't know as well. So it is a book that challenges and challenges the archival procedures that we are so used to. I don't know if I answered your question, but well, your question really opened up things to me. Thank you.
I just briefly comment on that, because I just remember that, and inside the book cover of Angola Janga, there is an overview of the person, of the people in the book. So it's all about personality, it's all about individuals, I guess. And we get that from the very beginning, because we are confronted with these people. I just remember that's interesting about Angola Janga as well. Yeah, and Lea, you wanted to comment on that, actually.
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Just a short comment about this, the kind of relevance or category Angola Janga has. The German Wikipedia on Quilombo is based lots in a part on Angola Janga. It's an important reference. I just checked the term in Wikipedia today, and I've seen that it's developed a bit more. But before, 6 months ago, Angola Janga was the main reference, and this shows how much is taken in serious as a reliable base on generating and distributing knowledge. So this was my comment.
Yeah, great to know this, because it suggests that it's really common in Brazil. It's a really strong discussion nowadays in Brazil about the notion of public history. Since we historians are so concerned about recent historical revisionisms. And we are really eager to spread our voices beyond academia. And but we must think about public history outside the national frontier. I mean, in Brazil, Angola Jungle is of course kind of popular, and there are several researchers and is adopted in schools and so on. But I guess it's not a reference to discuss the history of the Quilombos or the slavery resistance. It's seen more as a fiction book, and it's in comics, so we must be a little bit aware of it. And it's really interesting when it goes beyond the Brazilian frontier, and it becomes a major reference for Europeans and people from the US and so on to get in contact with the history of the black resistance against slavery. Really nice to know that. Thank you.
There are two new questions. The first one is from Amadeo and the second one from Peter.
Yes, how are you, Ivan? Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I had like two questions. One is sadly about the, I don't know if sadly, but I want to ask about Turma da Mônica. I know that Brazilian comics scholars do not like to talk a lot about Turma da Mônica because it's so bad. But I wanted to ask you if, at least as a form of tokenism, if Monica had ever had black characters. I was thinking recently about the black character from Peanuts, Franklin, who is there, but that does not have much of a personality. And it was like it was a request from several readers to Schulz to incorporate a black character, and then he did it, but he never did much with him. And then I wanted to ask you if you are familiar, I suppose you are, but with the character Deus from Rafael Campos Rocha, who is a black woman who is God and has adventures in the different time periods. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think about it, and how do you think this representation who joins a womanhood to blackness, to religion, has to say about blackness in Brazil nowadays? Thank you.
Of course, thank you, Amadeo. It's really great to be here with such kind colleagues. We are so far from each other, but we feel really close in the affinities and the partnership. And well, thanks for your questions. And you mentioned Turma da Mônica, Monica's Gang, as translated in English. And I personally, I do like Turma da Mônica, but I'm not a researcher of it. And I deeply regret the fact that Turma da Mônica, Monica's Gang are not well researched yet. It's a full neglected team of research. I mean, Maurício de Souza became bigger and the biggest artist, comics artist during dictatorship. I guess this is not something to forget. And there are still there aren't deep research on comics about Turma da Mônica's yet. But there are a few black characters, black kids in Turma da Mônica, in Monica's Gang. Like, for example, Jeremias, and for example, characters based on football players. Pelé was a comic character, and it was a comic book that made some success. The Pelézinho, Little Pelé, and then there is Ronaldinho Gaúcho, and then there is Neymar. But as you can imagine, these are very limited representations of Black characters in Monica's gang. These football comic book characters, they are like a seasonal. I mean, Pelé was during the 80s and 90s, and Ronaldinho Gaúcho during the mid-90s, 2000, and more recently Neymar, and well, when another football player became bigger, and then there will be another comic book. So it's not a very strong character. And Jeremias is totally secondary. He doesn't have a comic book by itself, and even in other comics stories, he's totally secondary. These are the ones that I can remember, basically. I'm not a current reader of Monica's Gang comic books. Maurício de Souza is very concerned about, I don't know how to say this in English, political correctness. Political correctness. And he has comics on disability people and comics on about the rights of women, and he dialogues a lot with the current government, from left wing to right wing. Maybe he has some histories. Maybe he has developed he and his crew has developed some comics on like people like against racism and so on. But these are definitely not his focus. Nowadays, actually, he has a whole line of graphic novels, the graphic MSP, where, for example, there are graphic novels entirely read by Jeremias, which is very amazing, very beautiful, well-acclaimed graphic novel. It was celebrated here. It won the Jabuti, which is the most important literary award here. So I guess in this graphic novel series, he develops deeper topics like racism, equality, that in comic books for kids he is not dealing with. And about Campos Rocha, I'm not a totally full reader of his works, but I do think Deus, essa gostosa, né? I do think it's really amazing. I do like him a lot. And he's totally connected to the recent political debates here in Brazil. So he's a very critical artist. And nowadays he's producing a comics series, I guess it's a comic book series called The Criança Índia, Indian kid, Indian child, which is like an Indian superhero kid kind of way, who fights against the government, and he's very critical of Bolsonaro. So he's a very interesting guy. I guess the comics environment here in Brazil is very diverse, and internet helped a lot. I guess during a lot of time it was a very masculine and white environment. There is this whole tradition that comes from Pasquim, and then the chiclete com banana, and then people that follow the chiclete com banana aesthetics like Alan Sieber and so on. And even women dialogued with this tradition, and they had to deal in some time, they had to deal with this tradition. Like, for example, Fabiana Langona, Chiquinha, or Cynthia Bonacossa. Bonacossa worked with Alan Sieber, and they had a lot of trouble because Alan Sieber is a really difficult guy. And nowadays we have a more diverse environment, and where people can use the possibilities introduced by the internet, and there are feminist collectives, black collectives, and I guess Campos Rocha's works are really well situated in this new context. So I do like him a lot. However, I am not fully aware in deep on his works. I answered you.
Just a quick comment. We have a discussion on Turma da Monica now in the chat. I will save it and send it via email, but I would like to continue with Peter's question.
Thank you so much, Ivan, for a very inspiring speech. And I really like the idea of the counter narratives. And then also you showed, and I think this becomes quite evident in Marcelo de Saletti, that there also is some kind of an iconographic paradigm shift. If Ayrton Tomás is a shift in paradigm about giving protagonism to Black people in comics, then I think Marcelo de Saletti is a shift in paradigm by really using a particularly Afro-Brazilian iconographic style. And I'm wondering, and this would be my question, because I really liked your approach as well of interconnecting the arts, which we've talked before your presentation a little bit too, and Rio 40 Graus, of course, and then there's really a whole group of works in film like Ganga Zumba, for example. There's Cinco Vezes Favela. There are all these works, Barravento, where you have, and maybe Barravento is an exception because it has the candomblé iconographical turn maybe as well. But in general, these works are really, let's say, iconographically neutral in a way. And they do not approach the visual traditions of Afro-Brazilian history that has grown. And I was wondering in Marcelo de Saletti, because I think there is really a shift, a paradigm shift in Afro-Brazilian representations, and he is one of many. And it's very interesting. I mean, I think basically starting with Abdias de Nascimento and also his kind of painting, where the orishas and the candomblé become so fundamental. And then I think this is the beginning really, actually in the late 60s, but having its effect only later because of the military dictatorship. But at least since the late 90s, I think this is becoming really strong. And if you think about people like Ayrton Heráclito, for example, the Boró, for example, where you have all the iconography of candomblé, I think there are a lot of really similarities between the ways of representing, and Marcelo de Saletti he's actually, the gaze is being reflected in his comics all the time. I mean, even the examples you've shown. And my question really would be, if you see a shift in paradigm, and what would be the interconnections in Marcelo de Saletti? Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I totally agree with you. I do consider, in terms of comics and comics tradition, comics history, I do consider de Saletti's work truly, I would say even revolutionary, truly innovative. And you see, he is not explicitly associated, linked to those groups that I mentioned. During a lot of time when we thought about Brazilian comics, it was Maurício de Souza, or it was the Pasquim group, and it's Hears. But de Saletti is from a rather distinctive perspective and tradition. So, and how successful he was, and how people really identified with his work. I guess he is really revolutionary in one point, and he really knew how to dialogue with these new contexts. When we in Brazil, there are several groups that do not accept racial discrimination or are willing to read more about African culture and Afro-Brazilian culture and so on. For example, in the last decades, in the first years of the 21st century, I guess 2006, 2007, there is an official statement that established that in schools, it's obligatory to teach about African history and Afro-Brazilian culture. So since 2006, 2007, 2008, people are studying in schools and universities about Brazilian culture, about Afro-Brazilian culture and African culture, African history. So these people, for example, kids, teenagers who had like 10, 11 years in 2006, 2007, they are now 21, 22, 23, and well, you have this formation, and this demand for complex history of slavery and a complex history of racism and of African history. And of course, you have this coming on several arts. You have poetries, you have Stephanie Borges, you have people from the favelas and from slums, you have Ferrez, there is this whole favela culture in movies, and well, there is a proper, there is now, I do consider it's like a proper time for a book like Angola Janga. And it's really interesting that the first two books written, drawn by de Salete, really focusing on present time violence and racism and like encrucijada and so on. They were not so successful in terms of reception and critics and so on. But when he develops a full-based research on the history of the Quilombos, people really love it. And it's funny because Angola Janga is even an expensive book. It's not a cheap book at all. Here in Brazil, it's like 90 reais, 80 reais, and it's really expensive for us. And Brazil is not a country known for its readership tradition. I mean, people here read like 2 or 3 books a year. And it's really cool in terms of practice of leadership. And how this book spread, I guess it's important to think about this public atmosphere that we have here. And that you mentioned, you brought to us several examples. They are rather different if we compare to the 60s contests, when people discovered the favela culture and the black culture of the human cities. It was a movement of white people moving to the favelas and doing some kind of ethnographic research. I see all these references you mentioned, like Cinco Vezes Favela or Rio 40 Graus. They are this kind of anthropological research, ethnographic research. And you see that there is this strangeness all the time, and this exotic gaze all the time there. Even though during the 50s and the 60s, there was this whole unionist movement around the favelas, but in aesthetical terms, I guess it did not move beyond. And nowadays we can see this difference that you mentioned, and I totally agree with you. And I guess Angola Janga is part of it. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but I would have a question if you allow me to ask it, because as you're also interested in history teaching, I'm really curious about this aspect. And actually, we talked about it already a little bit because we talked about public history and counter narratives and so on. And you already mentioned this law, which was decided upon in 2006, I guess, and that Afro-Brazilian history has to be part of the curriculum in schools. And in this context, I guess some didactical comics had appeared in the market. And I have just one example of those, which is called Afro HQ. But I was shocked about the content because it just presents some parts of Afro-Brazilian culture and everything is positive. It's like, yeah, we have the music, we have the food, we have candomblé, the orixá, we have capoeira, and this is all part of the Afro-Brazilian culture, and that's nice that we are so diverse. So the whole real history is missing. And I was just wondering what you think about teaching this part of Afro-Brazilian history, Palmares, for example, using comics, and what do you think about such comics like, this is just one example, but the ones who are supposed to be for school, but are too, in my view, too superficial.
Yeah. I tend to agree with you. I mean, after this statement that established the necessity of teaching Afro-Brazilian culture and African history in Brazilian schools and to be part of the curriculum, several works emerged trying to deal with it. Because it's also a challenge for teachers as well. I mean, for example, during my undergraduate years in Brazil, I did not have a chair or a discipline, I don't know how to say this, about African history. Really difficult. And the professors that develop full research on African history, they are really new. I mean, these researchers gained forces during the last 10, 15 years. So it's not a strong field in academia yet. So several teachers were already working for like 20, 30 years, and suddenly they had to teach about African history, and the government was not supportive to give them formation and well, courses and so on. So there was this demand for easy readings on African history and Afro-Brazilian culture. And historically, comics are considered an easy form of reading. Brazil as well. Since the 40s and 50s, we have in Brazil, there's been published in Brazil comics adaptation of literary work, for example. So people read like the Three Musketeers and Robin Hood and I don't know, you can imagine all the Huckleberry Finn and so on, adapted to comics language. And it's kind of Brazilian version of the classics illustrated. And there is this subtext in the end of the book, the end of the comics. If you like this comic book, go and run to your public library to read the original one because it's so much better. So it was really a thing to introduce you to more important and valid formats of reading. And during the first years of the 21st century, some comics were still working in that bias. I mean, were still really didactic in a bad way. really pedagogical in the bad way. And I guess I have this feeling that Angola Janga, for example, dialogues with the didactic purposes and with a didactic perspective. There are maps, there's technology, and this really helps students and teachers. But it goes beyond because it introduces challenges to how you narrate this history. And several of these adaptations of our didactic works, they do not challenge narrative. They just tell you information about Brazilian culture, and I don't think that's the case to discuss in schools. For example, for kids needs to narrate, needs to develop narratives, need to know how to develop narratives. And Angola Janga is perfect for this, because you can discuss how Angola Janga narrates, how he develops his narratives, how is the historiographic operation he manages in Angola Jangas. So I do hope that Angola Janga inspires other works to do the same. This master's dissertation I mentioned during my presentation by Roberta Marcelino Veloso, she tries to do a similar thing. She develops a full master research and so on, and in the end of her work, she produces a comics based on a primary source. Really interesting. And there is another guy here, another historian and comics artist here that tries to do something similar, that is André Toral, but he's still very attached to these pedagogical and didactic purposes and do not let the narrative flow. So I guess you read it right, Yannick. Several of these adaptations and books on history and books based on literary works are still really shy, actually, to assume the comics language in all of its consequences. and I do believe that's what Marcelo de Salete does. And he's really explicit about it. It's a history of Palmares. It's his history of Palmares. But it's a history that through the Black experience of violence during colonization, dialogues in a broader way. It's not restricted to his own personal experience. It touches, it affects other people. But it's a history of Palmares. So I guess that's a big challenge for comics artists and for teachers as well to, well, how to deal with the comics in for didactic purposes.
Thank you so much, Ivan. That was really, really interesting. And I think we will continue with the discussion actually next week, because Yasmin's topic is really closely connected to yours. So I'm really looking forward to that. Thanks to all of you for your patience and for being here, for your questions and comments. And yeah, I say bye-bye, enjoy the day. And thanks again, Ivan, for your great talk and for being here.
Thank you so much. Have a nice day, everyone. Bye-bye.